All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Now we're opening the season of the Ars in Northern California chapter. So a warm thank you all for inviting me. So for today's talk, I would like to present a circumscribed argument, which is mostly an extension of my previous RC general meeting talk back in April. I figured I would give some more context about what I very briefly for 15 minutes spoke about back in April. And it's going to be an argument concerning the lioness goddess Pakhet, whom some of you might know. And my presentation mostly stemmed from my interest in this goddess that dates back to my master's degree, really. So I really have to thank my professor, Mark Zecchi, for introducing me to her. But specifically, I will address her conceptualization within the ancient Egyptian mindset, as outlined in the textual sources of the Middle and New Kingdom, mostly, which I've analyzed mostly through the lens of the relationship between Pakhet and the sphere of ancient Egyptian magic, which happens to be another really big research interest of mine. So in doing this, I was hoping to offer some new insights on this goddess. Much has been written on the goddess already. We're going to see that. But I would like to examine a very well-known document, preserving a mention of the goddess that is really interesting. It hasn't, in my opinion, received enough attention in the past because it seems to point towards some degree of, since we're talking about a demonic, some degree of demonization, possible demonization of the goddess later in the New Kingdom. So I'm speaking about Papyrus Harris 501, largely known as the Harris Magical Papyrus. But anyway, so as far as research goals were concerned, the principal aim was to look into these specific sources in order to advance this hypothesis that this mention bears interesting implications for Pakhet's individual standing within the taxonomy, or what could be reconstructed as a taxonomy of evil in ancient Egypt, which is still a subject of much debate because we don't really know if there was at all a taxonomy, an indigenous taxonomy from within the ancient Egyptian mind. Well, we shall speak about that. And I would also like to try and engender some reflection into the concept of emic and etic approaches to this kind of topic. So in the context of a scholarly assessment of the ancient Egyptian mindset towards different classes of supernatural beings. So as an introduction. But first things first, I hope the hieroglyphs are not all screwed up, like just a bit. So, but first a little introduction. So for those of you who don't know her, the ancient Egyptian lion goddess Pakhet was a local deity exhibiting strong ties to the region of Middle Egypt, and who enjoyed a pretty long-lasting reverence throughout the 16th century Egyptian nome, otherwise known as the oryx nome or the antelope. So some of you might remember this area because it happens to be the location of the really very famous tombs, rock-cut tombs of Beni Hassan. So we are approximately coinciding with modern-day Minya Governorate. So here Pakhet was a recipient of a cult spanning apparently from the Middle Kingdom, possibly already the first intermediate period, until well into Ptolemaic times. Her role then later changes significantly with Ptolemaic times, but for the sake of today, we will stop to the New Kingdom. So the etymology of her theonym, so her divine name, has been linked by Hans Gödicke to the radical pach, expressing this idea of scratching. I like to translate this with slashing. I think it's more appropriate for a goddess of her standing and of her attributes. We shall see them. So this allows for a translation of her name as the slasher, the scratcher. Again, I prefer the slasher because it really conveys more of her violent nature, which is really why she stands out against other lioness goddesses. So given how, if you look at the spellings, the goddess is consistently depicted in therio-anthropomorphic form, so like half lioness, half woman. So it seems this appellation seems a fitting choice on the part of Egyptian theologists. And in fact, this divine name does seem to aptly convey the idea that she has an aggressive, feline nature that we shall talk about extensively today as a lioness. And it is also consistently emphasized by most of Pakhet's titles and epithets. So in keeping with their conceptualization as a lioness, virtually all the hieroglyphic spellings of Pakhet's name that you can see here. Again, I only included Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom sources for now. So all of them are that are attested with the considered time frame are usually determined by the classifier of the recumbent lion, usually, or variants. For example, the glyph E241 depicting the lion resting atop of a shrine. Most of these spellings come from Beni Hassan, and sometimes a cat, so it's a bit unclear there. Of course, Egyptian theologists like to reflect different aspects of a single god by playing a bit with the classifiers, as we all know. But the cat determinative really is, that is the only one instance. So with very few exception, we only see the lioness. It should be noted, though, that at some point, as you can see from the slides, the consonant, the aleph, seems to have been dropped in the New Kingdom. So there's some phonetical change going on. And eventually, we go to a spelling that is completely, where metathesis has occurred. So there's a switch in the phonetic of the name, so from Pakhet to Pechat, apparently. We shall talk about that too, because that's really relevant, also for the sake of this presentation. And throughout so basically from the Sayyid period, from the 26th dynasty into the Greco-Roman times, the spelling seems to be Pechat. So slightly different, it happens. We shall try to give a reason for that. And the determinative starts to be the egg. So the ostrich egg or the bird egg that usually determines, of course, divine beings. So it's not completely, it's still her to some extent. But we shall come back to the latter. So there's no archaeological remains, unfortunately, that have yet been uncovered. So maybe we just haven't looked enough. I like to think that we haven't looked enough because the epigraphical evidence is there for the Middle Egypt, but no archaeological remains have yet been uncovered. But the installation of a cult of Pakhet in the region, so again, the 16th Oryx nome, must date back at least to the 12th dynasty. How do we know that? Well, a sanctuary dedicated to her worship seems to have existed at some point during this period in the vicinity of the site of Menat Khufu, which is one of the proposed capitals for the 16th nome. We don't quite know which one it was, but Menat Khufu seems to be a good candidate for one of the proposed administrative capitals. Its location, exact location, also unknown. So we don't have this shrine, but clear records of Pakhet's cult in the area. And her earliest known cultic places survive, indeed, in the autobiographical inscription redacted in the nearby necropolis of Beni Hassan. So, as we know, home to the 11th and 12th dynasty rock-cut burials of the provincial governors of the Oryx nome. So here to cite some, for example, the nomarch Nemhotep held the title of Hem-Necher priest of Pakhet. Again, a fairly general title, but still relevant. Some of their consorts too, some of their wives also bear titles, priestly titles that are connected to a local cult of the goddess, such as the wife of Amenemhat, who was called Imeni. So the lady of the house, Hotepet, also a Hem-Necher priestess of Pakhet. But it's Khnehotep II who has perhaps the most interesting titles and really telltale offices. So namely those of Simati and Per Pakhet, so stolist priest, that usually is understood as, it is just a Greek word we use, but understood as one of the priests in charge of dressing the statue of the deity in the daily ritual. So still better than a Hem-Necher, apparently. And also we have, so the mention of the Per Pakhet. So that, of course, points out to a shrine. So there is a structure. There's a cultic structure here. And he's also Heritep Yaut and Hut-Necher Pakhet, so chief of works in the temple of Pakhet. So we have a sanctuary. We have a temple, apparently. So Hut-Necher points to an enclosed structure, so a bigger structure that a pair, let's say, would be. So that's really interesting. Again, we have no archaeological remains, unfortunately, of these structures. But again, I think we will find them. But anyway, together they constitute the only direct evidence of religious structures in the area with a dedicated clergy as early as the 12th dynasty. For reference, these are the titles of Khnehotep II in his tomb. So they appear on the door jambs, of course, where all of these titles are expressed. Actually, Khnehotep is also Imach or Imahi, Her Pakhet Nebetzeret, so like revered before Pakhet, mistress of the valley. But what we do know better in terms of archaeological evidence for Pakhet is that as early as the Middle Kingdom, her domain as earthly domain is indicated by this recurring epithet of Nebet Seret. So usually translated as mistress of the valley of Seret, or just the valley. Okay. The known instances of the toponym are and these attested spellings have been collected by Firman and Gersdorf earlier on in the 70s. So apparently the toponym should be read Seret. There was a previous reading from Fakhri that would be just Set. But if you look, I don't know how well you can see it, but in the second, on the southern architrave, there is a sheep in the spelling, so that is kind of indication that it should be read as Seret because there is a decan, so a constellation that was recognized by the Egyptians in the northern sky that was called Seret. We do have a phonetic spelling for that, so it should be read Seret. So the debate seems to have been settled at some point. So this is a picture of what this toponym must have expressed in ancient times. So this is an ancient name of the Wadi Batn al-Bakara, which is again in Middle Egypt. And it's a small desert valley, roughly 1.5 miles south of Beni Hassan's tomb. So again, real close. Along with the lost earlier sanctuaries, because there were apparently more, there is evidence for more than one sanctuary in Wadi Batn al-Bakara. So all these structures contribute to define the lion goddess's earthly domain, one that is marked by clearly secluded wadis and recesses opening up towards the desertic landscape and the eastern cavern routes. So we are in an area that was definitely projected towards desert more than it was, let's say, projected towards the Nile Valley. So we are definitely in a liminal zone here. Yes, this has disappeared, or no. No, it hasn't. Good. So it is at the mouth of this wadi, so Wadi Batn al-Bakara, that Pakhet's most notable and only surviving cultic place, which you might know of, is located. So the 11th dynasty rock-cut shrine, colloquially known as the Speos Artemidos, colloquially because this is the Greek name of it, because the Greeks eventually reached this area and realized that there was a very active animal cult dedicated to the goddess at some point. So many catacombs with cat mummies, sometimes lion mummies too, have been found close to Speos Artemidos. But also at some point, the Greeks identified Pakhet, the huntress, of course with Diana, so Artemis. So that would make sense. Today in Arabic is known as Istabla Antar, so like the stable basically. And so this temple was famously commissioned by a Chepsut. For a long time, we thought that it was Seti I, but actually Seti I just refurbished the structure because originally it was commissioned by Chepsut during her co-regency, apparently, with Thutmose III. And so we're around like 1473, 1458 BCE, later usurped and refurbished by Seti I. So by virtue of the prominence of Speos Artemidos as the main cultic place for the goddess, we know a lot about Pakhet and about her role inside the sanctuary. So the Speos Artemidos has received plenty of scholarship, on which I shall not stop very long today because that's not the main, let's say that's not the main focus. But it is nevertheless interesting to at least name, let's at least see how Pakhet is presented in this Speos, because despite them being thoroughly researched, it's only fitting to mention them at least briefly, okay, for the sake of presenting the broader context in which this investigation has been conducted, basically. So here's another small picture of the inside. Unfortunately, it's not very well preserved at all. Apparently, it also received the wrath of the Amarna period at some point because the images of Amun in the inside are hewn out. But in general, given that it's the Speos, there's humidity and everything, it has not, unfortunately, preserved very well. There used to be a lot of, let's say, epigraphical and artistic evidence. Now they're really, really, really eaten, unfortunately, by humidity. But this is what the Speos looks like inside today. It's really, really, really hard to find good pictures of the inside of Speos Artemidos because there are none. I haven't been there. I meant to go to take my own pictures, but apparently it's not a matter of camera. It's a matter of they're not really well preserved. So as we said, Pakhet is a lioness goddess, right? So it has been extensively noted that inside Speos Artemidos, Pakhet clearly is perceived as in line with the roles that are considered typical of other lioness goddesses, okay? Other sacred lionesses connected to the myth of the solar eye or of the distant goddess. What are we talking about is usually lion goddesses are connected to this myth of the solar eye, because usually some of you might remember also the myth of the celestial cow. So this is all about the destruction of mankind and the eye of Re leaving in the form of a lion goddess, leaving Egypt to go to Nubia, or to sometimes also to the Near East, depends on tradition. And so the lioness has to be appeased in order to be returned to Egypt and for the eye of Re to be restored. So this is all encompassed in the myth of the solar eye. So despite a strongly local character, because Pakhet does not really appear much outside of Middle Egypt, we do have at least one mention of a statue of the goddess that has been created in the New Kingdom for a shrine. We don't know that it's Speos Artemidos. It doesn't mention that. So there's not a lot of evidence about her, like physical evidence. But she nevertheless displays a rather multi-layered conceptualization that is at least comparable to that of the other fellow lionesses who enjoy a far more excessive following. So I'm talking about Sekhmet, Tefnut, of course, the primeval goddess, and Hathor, especially. So these are the main association that we find inside Speos Artemidos for Pakhet and also Isis. Now, for those of you acquainted with the sphere of magic, this basically means that all these goddesses have something in common, which is basically a connection with magic, especially with the personification of magic, of the concept of Heka, of magic, into the divine being called Weret Hekau. So as many of the goddesses, usually lionesses, connected to the myth of the solar eye, they're also connected to Weret Hekau in terms of mostly because they are powerful, of course, and this power can be both protective and destructive. So that's kind of the deal with all of the lionesses, and Pakhet definitely displays all of these traits. She's often compared to Sekhmet and Tefnut in terms of the epithets that Pakhet has. Now, she does not have a lot of her epithets inside of Speos Artemidos don't necessarily stress this animalistic nature that we find somewhere else, for example, in the coffin text that we're going to see in a second. Sekhmet is often addressed as lady of slaughter. Sekhmet is notoriously a carrier of pestilence. She has very, very scary and baleful emissaries, the Hatu demons. So the basically disease-bearing demons that can be unleashed onto humanity. So Sekhmet is, of course, usually regarded as pretty fearful, pretty scary. Tefnut, of course, is a primeval lioness, but also figures as a fierce huntress, generally a force to be reckoned with. So all of the lionesses, the goddess that are in lionine form, tend to have these very strong features, and whenever their presence is invoked, it is so done by appealing to the inherent power of their animalistic traits. So the potential for the safeguarding and annihilation is, of course, also a defining feature of the concept of Heka, of magic. So in harmony with such a connotation, inside Speos Artemidos, we do have a direct assimilation of Pakhet with the sphere of magic by the attribution to Pakhet of the epithet of Weret Hekau, which again she shares also with Isis, with Hathor, sometimes with Sekhmet. So as Speos Artemidos, you can see here, first in the texts pertaining to Hatshepsut, and then also with Seti I. What we see is her Pakhet syncretized with Weret Hekau, so this personification of the very concept of magic, or perhaps more appropriately, a personification, because magic is a very loaded term that we try to avoid for all of us who study Egyptian magic. Magic is an inaccurate, probably better described as inaccurate term to describe what was really a creative force that the Egyptians recognized for the gods. So this is the force that helped the gods create the universe, put the universe into being, and it's a force that can be more or less manipulated by the gods and by humans, of course, if they know the appropriate tools, the appropriate spells, and so on. But the inherent feature of Heka is that it can be both protective or destructive. As a very potent force, it can go pretty much both ways. Now, inside Speos Artemidos, so we do see that in the Hatshepsut texts, the identity of Pakhet and Weret Hekau is established. So we have Weret Hekau Pakhet. Now, the position of Weret Hekau seems to point towards a total assimilation. So this is not an attribute. So this is not Pakhet, great of magic, as it is later with the text of Seti I. This is literally the god or goddess Weret Hekau and Pakhet. So this is syncretism. Later in the text of Seti I, we do see Pakhet Weret, Nebet Seret, Nebet Pet. So Pakhet the Great, Lady of the Speos or Lady of the Valley, Lady of the Mistress of the Sky, and Weret Hekau. So in this case, it's also adjectival. So this is literally Pakhet, Great of Magic. So because of the association inside the Speos, whatever the case, so Pakhet is clearly identified with Weret Hekau through her role played in the legitimation and coronation rites, and through the established association between the Uraeus, so like the rearing cobra on the sun god's brow, and also Pharaoh, of course, and the sphere of Hekau. So this is let's say a conceptual unity. There's a conceptual unity between Heka, the myth of the solar eye, and the goddess and the destructive power of it. Now, interestingly enough, Barbara Lesko has pointed out that since the late Old Kingdom, Weret Hekau was also a resident of the so-called Perware in Heliopolis. So this structure should have been a structure. It's also mentioned very often in funerary texts as a, let's say, heavenly place, but it must have been a real place in Heliopolis. So it was the shrine where the king would stop after the coronation ceremony had been carried out in order to have the Uraeus officially installed, affixed to his brow. So again, so this syncretism with Weret Hekau seems to point towards a role of Pakhet in royal legitimation or in royal coronation, which is perfectly fitting because indeed we have two kings devoting these speos to her in order to, let's say, in order to basically garner her protection. So basically, Pakhet here is seen taking on the role of Weret Hekau and bestowing power and protection on the king in her capacity as an embodiment of the Uraeus and Weret Hekau. So basically, Pakhet is here the Uraeus, that the fire-spitting Uraeus ready to protect and at the same time wreak punitive havoc upon evildoers and enemies of Re or Pharaoh. So again, so the role of Pakhet inside the Speos Artemidos is markedly royal, and is the only instance where we have that, because if we go a bit back in time, specifically to the coffin texts, so we start to see something a bit different here. So this aspect of the protective role of the lion and this association with the Heliopolis too, is perhaps best illustrated by some of the earliest sources available for Pakhet, and they're basically dating back to the coffin texts. And so Pakhet's presence within the sphere of magic, so we've seen it for the New Kingdom in Speos Artemidos, but it actually dates back to the Middle Kingdom, so to the coffin texts, where she appears in the sphere of funerary magic. So this is a rundown of some of the sources available for mentions of Pakhet that have been found on coffin texts. So of course, this is a list of coffins, hence the coffin texts. And we shall have a look at those to try to assess a role inside these texts, so in the sphere of funerary magic, and also what I like to call as productive magic. So in ancient Egyptian magic studies, you will find a distinction between what is called productive and destructive magic. Now, I'm only making use of these categories right now because for the sake of this presentation, but really they are artificial. The Egyptians did not distinguish between productive and destructive magic. So magic is a neutral, morally neutral tool that can be used either in a productive way or destructive way. So for example, a funerary spell is productive magic. A spell against the king, very, very much destructive magic. So it always comes to mind the fate of Ramses III, was killed by palace plot, and then of course it was found evidence of evil doing, of foul play, magical foul play. So texts with execration text towards the king and so on. But generally, Heka is indeed a morally neutral tool. So in a coffin text, Pakhet is really a vehicle of productive magic, meaning she acts as the protection of the deceased as early as the Middle Kingdom. So this is, for example, coffin text 422, which is usually concerned with an offering for receiving bread in a necropolis, and it pertains to the bulk of texts that are usually referred to as manuscript H. This is just a designation to distinguish the provenance of the coffin texts. And it has been noted by Roccati that they display a wide number of references to Heliopolis. So the context here, I think we can already see where I'm going. the presence of Pakhet in coffin texts that are really imbued with solar theology, and of course like a Heliopolitan context, seems to make perfect sense. So the purpose of these texts, of these bulk of texts, of the entirety of manuscript H, was basically to ensure that the deceased was fully equipped for his travel in the afterlife in order to be reborn daily within the solar cycle, hence the offerings and so on. Now, closing the utterance, it's not a very long one, so it seems to be mostly about offerings and Pakhet. So closing the utterance with a slightly empathic tone, the name of Pakhet is involved as a means of ultimate protection for the deceased. So you can see, to receive bread, I'm he who made his seat in Heliopolis. So the speaker, the practitioner, is identifying himself with Atum, of course, the god of Heliopolis. I am he who rises, I'm the Ben, and so on. I am Nekbet and Upet, and the great Pashet, now so very slightly different spelling, the great Pashet is my protection. Now, that this is actually a mention of Pakhet has been debated because so the issue with the coffin text is that, of course, you will find different versions of them because they are on a coffin, so there are regional variants, there are just plainly sarcophagi that are not, coffins that are not well preserved. So this error is slightly ruined, slightly erased, but most scholars concur into thinking that is actually in fact Pakhet. And indeed, despite not being unanimous, it makes sense, it kind of makes sense that it's Pakhet that's mentioned here. Lights, for example, Christian Lights does recognize her name. So the source is from Asyut, so again, Middle Egypt, so it would make sense. Seems to better preserve the name of the goddess, so as Pashet Weret. So we are definitely faced with at least a female deity because there's the determinative of the seated goddess, and she is invoked as a protector of the deceased during his journey from the darkness of the necropolis into the light, of course, of a new existence. Now, having considered all these aspects, the underlying context of the spell does suggest that the presence of a lion goddess, lioness, like Pakhet would be completely fitting. There's again a background that's heavily imbued with solar theology, and she clearly appears as an aspect of the solar eye here too. So again, this will be a precursor to the conceptualization that we can see for the New Kingdom. And her role in 422 does coincide with the expected profile of a lion goddess. So the same role being notoriously bestowed on other feline deities, such as Tefnut, Sekhmet, Mafdet, and selectively to Hathor within the coffin texts. So also by comparison, we can see that it should be Pakhet we're dealing with. Now a bit more dense is coffin text 469. So she reappears in 469 and 470. 470 is an abbreviated version of 469. And the latter is basically, 469 is the lengthiest and most interesting attestation of Pakhet within the coffin texts. This is where we find most of her epithets, the most important ones. And so there's really a rich self-standing intertextuality in this spell. It's a very complicated spell, very obscure, as often the coffin texts get. Moreover, because 469 bears striking similarities with, some of you might know the name, the Cannibal Hymn. So the Cannibal Hymn used to be another one of the pyramid texts, so 273. It's a very lengthy one, so lengthy that it has been interpreted as a ritual in its own. It does have a strong rituality to it, so it points to the performance of actions inside, say, the pyramids of Unas and so on, so inside the royal pyramid. And so basically 469 is within the tradition of the so-called resurrection ritual of the pyramid texts. Again, pretty dense. So as pointed out by Ayer, who was the first one to study cannibalism, the central theme is basically to eat the magicians, all of them. So again, we have the context of magic. Now, in this really, really dense context, we do have, if you read there, so he has cleared the sky, he has joined the earth, he has cleared the great Nut before him, the great Pakhet. I am granted appearance, and who guides me is the great Pakhet, the lion bear, which is in the Perwer shrine. With piercing eyes, with sharp claws, the ferocious lioness, lady of the ones who see, the lioness who sees and catches prey in the darkness. So this is by far the lengthiest, let's say, sum of the epithets of Pakhet that really obviously stress a feline nature, so like animalistic nature, which again makes sense considering the apotropaic role of the lion that we've seen already. And it is pretty striking. So see, these are all epithets that are really interesting because, of course, they're perfectly fitting the profile of a lioness, so that she would have sharp or penetrating eyes. I like penetrating more. Sharp doesn't quite convey it. So with sharp claws, of course, again, the scratcher, the slasher. Masahut, the fierce lioness. That's a fairly weird, tricky translation. And a great deal of emphasis, so it's put on showcasing her dangerous side, right? Dangerous character and the ability to hurt potential enemies. So as a huntress, Pakhet is also Nebet Mau, so lady of those who see, Mait Ma, the lioness who sees, and Shedet, Het, and Keku, so the one catching prey in the darkness. So now this is one level. To better understand their funerary role, there's also one of these epithets. So if you can see somewhere there, it says Nenmut or Nenmet. So that's really interesting, and it deserves a separate mention in terms of, because it helps us reconstructing the conceptualization of her in the coffin texts. So it's not in 422 or in 420, it's just in 469, so there's one instance. But it is interesting that Nenmet as a name can be traced back as far as the pyramid texts. So again, we seem to have some sort of textual continuation from the pyramid text into the coffin texts, which is not uncommon. So Nenmet is a name for the lion bier, so basically a bed, a funerary bed. That, but in the pyramid text, it's clear designation for the sky. So at some point, Pakhet is also to some way identified with this lion bier, lifting up the deceased into the heavens. So we also have the celestial aspect, which is really interesting. It kind of echoes, it is echoed by Seti I's texts when she's called the bed pet. Usually only celestial goddesses have this epithet, and usually Pakhet would not have it unless she is connected also to the myth of the celestial cow. So again, Hathor, so the entirety of this myth. So the name itself is then of very ancient origin, and it's conceptually linked to the solar theology by means of the feline nature. So again, we find all of the ideas about Pakhet that we've already seen cemented in the New Kingdom, but they are all already inside the coffin texts. So based on the evidence from the coffin texts, so the reason for her presence in the funerary texts can be seen as in line with the role traditionally ascribed to the goddesses associated with the solar eye, who share in their divine father's right power. And as such, Pakhet acts as a protector of the deceased and his guide into the duat. An equation is established with the celestial lion beer, so Nenmet, with Pakhet as acting as its divine personification. Now, as a matter of fact, so lions in general, so I'm talking about lions in general in funerary literature, but in ancient Egyptian magic and religion in general, they're generally invoked for their safeguarding abilities, right, which derive from their being formidable beasts in nature. The ancient Egyptians were very well acquainted with lions and lionesses. They were still roaming the, let's say, the outskirts of settlements and so on, up very well into the New Kingdom. So definitely a force to be reckoned with, definitely something to be kept at bay by all means necessary, usually magic. So lions are often placed as guardians of the secret places, such as gates and doors, usually in the netherworld. Here's a picture of the god Aker, so the double lion guarding the horizon, so the entrance and the exit to the duat. But the sacred lionesses especially were also petitioned as dispensers of protection. Mut at some point becomes the chief of these lionesses. She's not often depicted in leonine form, but Mut is definitely motherly in this regard. Sekhmet is not often invoked for her motherly aspect. She doesn't quite not have that. She is invoked mostly to petition that she do not, in fact, spread disease upon mankind. She's definitely very feared. And Tefnut, of course, she's also petitioned for, very often for protection in the coffin texts and in general in funeral literature. But so they were largely worshipped for their beneficial aspects, but this veneration is at all times counteracted by deep reverential fear. So this is quite the deal with the lionesses. So we've seen, up to now we've seen Pakhet as a vehicle for productive magic. Okay, so Pakhet in a mostly positive conceptualization, right? despite a great deal of emphasis being put on her animalistic, bestial nature. But that has an apotropic reason, so it kind of makes sense. Now, there's a very, I love the concept of magic in ancient Egypt because it's a very human urge, the need to manage this ambivalence, right, of the divine. So it can be productive, it can be destructive. And it's very well attested in all aspects of ancient Egyptian religion. In fact, spells, magic offered an outlet to the practice of neutralizing dangers through basically ingratiating oneself with the very source of the danger. So the idea is to fight like with like. This is pretty much how ancient Egyptian magic works in general. So the protective power of these beings can be said to obey the magical principle of repelling like with like, where the destructive raw energy stemming from their fearsome aspect is skillfully harnessed by the practitioner, by a magician, a priest, in order to achieve a more desirable, positive outcome. So up to now, so following the analysis we've seen of the selected sources so far, so it is possible to affirm with certainty that Pakhet does display all the features one would expect from a leonine goddess, from a supernatural being of great power, which can comfortably be assigned the label of god or goddess. So she falls very well within the nature paradigm, as many other lion goddesses do, despite, again, this emphasis put on their violence, their aggressive nature. But this is at least true for the Middle Kingdom and early New Kingdom sources. However, even as she protects the king in coronation rites, so we're now into the New Kingdom, her figure is still characterized by as being strongly feral. So her violent qualities are consistently highlighted. So as I like to say, if you're good at magic, you're also good at danger. Pakhet definitely befits this, let's say, this role. And so up to now, so we've seen only the positive aspect. Now, I wondered at some point, being that I delve into the demonic in ancient Egypt, and I do like to bend this category of nature, of the idea that we have towards how exclusive, to some extent, the category of nature, so of divinity, was in ancient Egypt. So I started to look at different sources for Pakhet, because despite, even though it's possible to see the same role for other goddesses, again, Sekhmet usually is pretty negative, usually. We don't really see the beneficial aspect of Sekhmet, apart from when she's not wreaking havoc on humanity. I still thought that something about Pakhet didn't quite sit well with me, especially as I started to analyze this papyrus. Harris, the magical papyrus Harry 501, which we will see in a second. Because, so it's very easy in Egyptology to define the divine, right? It's really easy to define what a god is, what a goddess is. They usually have benevolent features, right? They are celestial gods, they have celestial abodes, and so on. But anyone involved in really researching ancient Egyptian religion, and especially demonology, so the category of the demonic in ancient Egypt, knows how much of a daunting task it can be. Because as much as we're pretty comfortable describing a god, identifying what a god is, we're not as comfortable defining what a demon is in ancient Egypt. And the reason for this are multiple. So to summarize the main issues faced by Egyptologists, and this serves to me as a framework for the kind of research I've done on Papyrus Harris, the main issues are basically reconstructing the indigenous characterization of malevolent beings. So that is to say, assessing if there is a taxonomy of evil. Is there anything in the Egyptian thought that we can describe as a demonology, so as a compilation of demonic beings? And B, the quality of such taxonomies. So like, how do they work? What is it distinguish? What are the criteria? So according to ancient Egyptian belief, in general, there are 4 categories of beings, of supernatural beings. So there's men, Remech, just humans, spirits of the deceased, so the Ahu, who can also turn malevolent, gods, Necheru, and then there's some supernatural beings who aren't really accurately described by any of the forming categories. So these entities are often depicted as human-animal hybrids, or they exhibit a high degree of monstrosity. So sometimes they are hybrid in hybrid form. And they were believed to inhabit the liminal spaces between the divine and the mortal realms. Now, gods do not inhabit liminal spaces. Gods have very, very well-defined abodes, very well-defined domains. Demons do not. It's also, so all this is made even more daunting by the fact that we do not have a word for demon in ancient Egypt. This is entirely our construction. There is no word, there's no lexeme in the ancient Egyptian language that is translatable in a way that aligns with the Western concept of demon, right? Which is heavily informed by Judeo-Christian tradition. So I would say not an emic perspective, right? So it's very much external to what was the ancient Egyptian mindset. So as we investigate these categories, we really always at all points need to be wary about introducing etic categories, so alloctonous, not indigenous, to the culture. If you really want to understand what was the Egyptian way of dealing, if they dealt in any way taxonomically with these beings. So indeed, this idea of demons or demonic agents as conceptually alien to the category of nature or opposed, right, good and evil, is looking increasingly fraught within contemporary research. And while the ancient Egyptian theologists clearly distinguished between malevolent and benevolent beings, they were still comprised apparently underneath a category of nature. So supernatural beings are all, to some extent, naturu. Now, they are distinguished by their function, by their location, by their demeanor, especially towards humans, of course. So scholarly attempts to label certain beings belonging to the ancient Egyptian religious lore as demonic has often resorted to the scientific choice of etic approaches. So, for example, nowadays we still try to explain ancient Egyptian demons with the category or the idea of the daimon in the Greek lore, right? So daimones, as opposed to theoi in Greek, are intermediate beings, again, sometimes demigods, beings with intermediate capacities between a god and a human, usually minor deities, understood as minor deities. So this kind of could be a fitting, apt description for ancient Egyptian demons in general. It's not quite the same. But we are basically forced at some point to resort to different categories in order to try and describe, for descriptive purposes, all of ancient Egyptian demons. Now, it goes to without saying that one can only reconstruct these categories, let's say, trying as much as possible to adhere to an emic perspective, of course. So because the demonic idiosyncrasies of ancient Egypt is really complex. Again, we don't have a unified system of thought about the demons. They have different functions at different places. So it's better to analyze all of these through the lens of criteria such as function, demeanor, iconography, and placement. So just as a quick rundown, so first of all, we have function and status, right? So gods are powerful universal deities who maintain Ma'at, cosmic order. They were worshipped in temples, had a priesthood, rituals were dedicated to them. Their power is usually immense and all-encompassing, so they do not have limits. They have maybe specific functions, but they do not have limits because, again, they are all, they share in the Ka of the creator gods, in the Ka of Re, so they're all powerful. Demons, on the contrary, were not worshipped in temples. We do not have temples until a certain era, so until the Greco-Roman times, where something changes. We do not have sanctuaries dedicated to demons. We don't have priesthood. Instead, these beings were interacted with through magical spells, mostly to repel them. So this is kind of a big difference. Then nature and morality. So gods are generally benevolent, although there can be a dichotomy. And demons are usually either malevolent or at least scary. And I'm thinking about the guardian demons, for example, of the Book of the Dead. They are not inherently malevolent, but it is important to know their names. It is important for the deceased approaching these deities, all the gates, as it outlined, for example, in the Book of Gates, with the right knowledge in order to neutralize the potential threat. If someone approached a gate demon without the proper name, without the proper formula, supposedly something bad would happen. But they're not inherently evil. And then we have presence and interaction. So gods are usually inhabitants of celestial realm, temples, Demons populate liminal regions. For example, the gate guardians, of course, a gate is a liminal region in itself, but sometimes we have notions of demons, for example, the were demons, really poorly understood, who haunt lakes, channels, fields. So usually, most of the time, they're liminal realms. Now, I go to my main source. Now that we've defined what the demonic is and is not, I would like to introduce Papyrus Harris 501, mostly known as the Harris Magical Papyrus, because not much consideration has been given to, in my experience, to exploring instances where the text reflect an entirely negative perception of Pakhet. Because up to now, we do have the scary role of the apotropic lion and so on. We do not have a fully negative conception of the goddess. But as it turns out, we do. And it is in this very papyrus. So I've turned to this papyrus that is named after its first possessor. Of course, Harris had a huge collection. Now, unfortunately, the original 9 pages of the record, as I started working on this, I realized that we have no picture of the original because the original doesn't exist anymore. These are the joys of research as you start trying to make a, let's say, concerted effort to study a page, and then you find out that it's not available anymore. Now, originally was 9 pages, 9 of the recto and 3 of the verso. You can see it here. It is one of the preserved pages. You can see that it's written in hieratic, black and red ink. You can see the slight red dots. So these are a notation system for magical text. They express the end and beginning of a new spell. So the other pages only remain in fragments, and unfortunately the one I needed was verso 2, so like the second page, which apparently doesn't exist anymore, because even Shabbat in 1860 was the first one to work on this papyrus. He worked on a tracing of the original, but then the original was lost, because there was apparently a gunpowder explosion in Alexandria where Harris was keeping all the papyri, and so it vanished. Now, I want to ask you, so I know this is a black and white picture, but so these are some of the preserved fragments, because apparently, so as it turns out, some of the fragments turned out in Heidelberg, in the collection of Heidelberg, so they still exist. They were able to piece them together, so we have the fragments of the missing pages. Now, do you see any combustion here? Any sign of combustion at all? No. So that is a hoax. I don't think an explosion ever happened here. I do think that the papyrus was cut, as honestly, so this is the last page. Yeah, actually it's cut, but you can see that it's clearly cut. So there's no combustion, there's no burning on the papyrus. So as it was normal, because it's a huge papyrus, it's a very long one. That's what is the great magical papyrus. It was cut and sold separately, of course, on the antiquities market, which is nice though, because it means that maybe other fragments are available, and eventually maybe we'll be able to piece back together the entirety of this page. But anyway, we do have I have this. So this is the facsimile as it appears in the British Museum publication. So this is a facsimile of the tracing. It happens sometimes. So Papyrus Harris, a bit of context. We don't know the provenance. It's likely Thebes. Harris said it might have been Thebes, and we don't know if the Sebachim we don't know if the Sebachim information was correct. So supposedly it comes from Thebes because the paleography has been analyzed and it looks compatible with Thebes. It dates to like either the late 19th dynasty or the earliest 20th. So we're still in the Ramesside period, right? Now, what does it contain? So it's a magical text, of course. So it's mostly concerned with spells against crocodiles, but the verso preserves several incantations against dangerous wild animals. So especially section Y, so the second page of the verso, column 1, again lost, is dedicated to a spell to ward off predatory animals like lions, hyenas, and jackals. And Pakhet, along with Sekhmet and Taweret, is the target of the practitioner, so the target of this spell. And there's a herdsman, so the practitioner or the reciter identifies himself with the god Hauron, which is of Canaanite origin, right? It's not an indigenous god to Egypt, to invoke the intercession of Horus in order to protect the person from said animals. So this is the page we're concerned with. Now, what could be considered unusual here, and I'm going straight to the text for 1 second. What is unusual here is that, so this is the relevant section. So it's a formula. So it starts in the same way, so it's repetitive, as many ritual texts are. And it goes with, may there be sealed the mouth of lions and hyenas, of jackals, first of all animals with raised or long tail, who eat flesh and drink blood. May there be sealed the mouth of the high animal, we don't know what that is. May there be sealed the mouth of the beg animal, the mouth of the dipperam animal, we have no idea who they refer to. May there be sealed, so I am at line 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say of the single ones. May there be sealed the mouth of Pakhet. May there be sealed the mouth of the seer. May there be sealed the mouth of Sekhmet, the beautiful. May there be sealed the mouth of Taweret, the living. So these texts we're concerned with. Now, apart from the mentioning of the god Hathor, which has been interpreted by lights at least as an indication that the papyrus is of foreign origin. Now, this is the first thing I would like to dispute before we delve into why I chose this specific text. So right after this spell, there's this section. Now, I only keep the hieratic because I don't read Canaanite, but this is Canaanite. This is not Egyptian. So the last section, section Z of the papyrus, is in the Canaanite language. Now, based on this, many scholars have thought of this as a foreign text. I don't think there's any reason to believe that this is a foreign text, just because one section is in Canaanite, and I'm going to tell you why. Because first of all, so in the New Kingdom, Canaanite gods entered the ancient Egyptian pantheon as an effect of the Hyksos domination, of course, of the Second Intermediate period. We do see the adoption of certain Canaanite gods, Near Eastern gods like Astarte, Reshep, Hathor, and so on. So the first mention of these gods are dated to the reign of Amenhotep II. So it's pretty early on. We have plenty of papyri where these gods are mentioned that are religious in nature or magical that do not come from the Near East. They have been made in Egypt, mentioning gods that they had already adopted into their pantheon. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. Here's, by the way, is a picture of a small wee Ramses II protected by the god Hathor, which is usually depicted in falcon form. He was really revered throughout Giza, okay, so which is of course a hub for falcon gods like Re or Rakti and so on. So it was very much established within the Egyptian pantheon. So to think that this papyrus is Canaanite in origin, just based on the mention of foreign deities, I find that a naive argument that I'm very strongly disputing here. Nobody has given any attention to this text in a while, so I felt like it needed some justice. So it's very likely not Canaanite in origin, despite this section. What happened here, and first of all, so this papyrus does come from Egypt, we know, and the themes, by the way, which is the most telltale signs, are quintessentially Egyptian. There's one section in the papyrus that's in Canaanite. It doesn't have to be a foreign text. By the way, we also have plenty of magical texts that mention foreign demons. For example, Papyrus Leiden 1, 343 and 345, which has been edited by Susanne Beck, and that is a conjuration text against the disease-bearing demon Samanu or Saman of Near Eastern origin, and his counterpart Ahu. So it's two gods that are basically the Egyptian and Canaanite counterpart of each other. So again, there's syncretism here of cultures and so on. Nobody has ever suggested that that is a foreign text just because a foreign demon is addressed. And the part dedicated to Samanu is in Canaanite. The part dedicated to Ahu is in Egyptian. Why? Not because the text is foreign in origin, but because you will address the demon in the correct language. If you address Samanu in ancient Egyptian, you might not get that. You are not neutralizing the demon. So as I think it was Roccati who first proposed this, and I absolutely agree. So this is just like the correct, again, it's about the correctiveness of the spell. So it has to be in Canaanite because you are addressing a Canaanite demon. So again, this is not a foreign, this is absolutely not a foreign text. So anyway, so what drew me to this? My pointer, do you see my pointer? Okay, so if you look briefly at the transliteration here, so we have so we have a determinative article before the name of Pakhet. So it's may there be sealed the mouth and so on of ta Pakhet. So usually divine names do not have an article. This is very much a thing of demons, because demons are identified by their function, by grammatically identifying them is a means to distinguish the demonic from the divine. Now, if you notice, Sekhmet does not have an article, it's just Sekhmet. Taweret does not. I mean, I know that Ta is part of the name of Taweret, and actually Professor Lucarelli could not be here today. We've been working on something saying that, so at some point, in Deir Medina, there's a lot of Ostracans naming Ta Weret, or the Werets, plural. So that has been identified as the name of a demon because they are clearly to be warded off. There are spells against them. There's like there's also some amuletic thing going on because there's an Ostracan saying please. So someone has lost their Weret, which appears to be an object, which would make sense. So some sort of amulet. So writing to a priest, please make me another Weret because I lost the one you made for me. So there's some ritualistic aspect to it. Now, it is very possible that all the instances where Ta Weret is mentioned, it's just Taweret. So the goddess, the hippo goddess Taweret. Now we're still working on that. But anyway, so in this case, for the purpose of this, this is just Taweret. So the goddess Taweret. So there's no Ta before that. So we have two deities. And Pakhet is a deity too, but she has an article. So this has received absolutely no attention whatsoever. Lights, who published this in the New Kingdom Magical Papyri for the British Museum, does not address this. And I think it's in fact really relevant. So it's relevant for many reasons. So there's not just that. Let me go back. So there's a problem here too. And I welcome your insight on this. So again, I'm working on a tracing, right? So the second part of, so this is where Pakhet is mentioned, okay? This is the second part, like may there be sealed the mouth of, there's another Ta. So if you notice it, the Ta has been added later. It was not in the sentence. Now, because I'm dealing not with the original, I don't know, unfortunately, if there is an error of the person who was originally tracing this. Again, it seems unlikely to me because it's not like copying, it's tracing. I mean, they're tracing paper, but it's possible, of course. They just forgot the Ta. But it could also be an ancient error, or an ancient doubt. Now, in the coffin text, we are many centuries apart, but in the coffin text, we definitely see that where the name is Pakhet is invoked, there's some confusion as to which being is meant. So, and we can see that for many other divine names or names of beings that are not like as popular as others. They would not get the name of Isis wrong, but they might get the name of Pakhet wrong. So, moreover, it is missing one of the dots, which to me seems to be a bit too many coincidences to think that it's a modern error of the person who was tracing this. So I do think this was the original papyrus. I wish I could see that. Why am I saying this? Because the being that follows Pakhet, so this Ta Nu, so this is a hapax legomenon, meaning there's no other mention of this being whatsoever as a divine being in any other text. Like, I haven't found anything. It appears to be a hapax. Now, the way it's spelled, it's determined with the seated goddess, right? So of course this could be a divine being, or at least could be an explanation. But if you look at the spelling of Ankh or Ankhet, so the Taweret, the living, that's also it's an adjective, but it's also determined, or well, I mean it's an epithet, of course, but it's also determined with the same classifier, right? So what I'm asking here is there seems to be some degree of confusion about the separation of Pakhet and this seer. And if we go back, if you remember what we saw in the coffin texts, the stress on the seeing ability of Pakhet as a lioness is really, it occurs in at least 3 epithets. Okay, some of them are scratching, but most of them are the seer. So my question would be, is it possible that it's true that the formulaic part, so like may there be sealed the mouth and so on, is repeated, but they forgot the dot that would separate the 2 spells, right? And this Ta seems to be had been added posthumously. So I wonder if the seer could be just an epithet of Pakhet, since Sekhmet has an epithet there, of course, the beauty or the full of beauty, and so does Taweret, because this seer is not attested elsewhere. So I think it's possible to make this argument, because yeah, mostly that the seer would be a really fitting epithet for Pakhet. It really does. Now, some other elements need discussion. So again, here, what I'm trying to do here is it possible that Pakhet, towards the end of the New Kingdom, starts exhibiting like really demonic-like qualities? Okay. So if you look at the spelling of Pakhet here, it's not Pakhet, it's Pechat. So again, the metathesis has already happened, so like the phonetical phenomenon, switching the vowels, right? Now, if you read the TLA, the corpus of the Egyptian text and so on, and if you read one of the Brooklyn magical papyri, it's 48, I don't remember the other digits, sorry, top of my head, but anyway, Papyrus Brooklyn 46 something is also magical texts. It dates back to the 26th dynasty, so we're in the late period. It seems that by the late period, Pechat as a name only designates a lion. So it's not Pakhet anymore. Now, I need to do further research into this because for the purpose of today, I would only, but I do need to do a lot more research on that. But it is interesting because I believe that here, it's really clear that the goddess Pakhet is meant, even though she is given a determinative, which would instead stress her bestial feature, right, rather than the godly one, rather than the divine one. Again, it doesn't seem completely implausible to me. Why am I saying this? Because the New Kingdom is also it's also the era where the Egyptians start to really come up with this taxonomy of evil. Okay, so we see the appearance of the Book of the Gates, of all of the new Netherworlds books. So there's a concerted effort to classify all these beings on the Netherworlds. It reflects an anxiety towards dealing with these beings, and it's definitely also an effect of the Hyksos domination. So chaos has entered the Nile Valley, right? So I do think that the goddess Pakhet is meant here, not a lion, not a general lion. Moreover, I don't think she would have the egg determinative. That is still a divine classifier. So but this might be the first earliest instance of the phenomenon of metathesis. It still meant Pakhet, not the lioness at this point, but we are still in late 19th, early 20th dynasty. So this might be the first instance of the spelling with metathesis that still means Pakhet, though. Later, it seems to just mean lioness. Yes. Now, just a concise grammatical. I swear I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I compiled a small list of showing that demonic names tend to have a determinative article. Okay. Now so the text is Middle Egyptian, so the papyrus is in Middle Egyptian, but since we are in the Ramesside period, of course, late Egyptian is kind of seeping through the cracks. So ta, pa, na, these determinatives usually are very late Egyptian. You would not use them in Middle Egyptian. But of course, it's colloquial language that enters the written language at this point. But by the Ramesside period, they just mean a determinative. So like the Pakhet, it's demonstrative. Sorry, it's not really demonstrative, but like it's just determinative. So in classical Egyptian grammar, divine names, again, typically do not take a demonstrative article of any kind, unless there's a special emphasis on their quality as beings rather than as deities, but we don't really see that. On the contrary, in magical and demonic texts, we do sometimes see the addition of definite and demonstrative articles, because again, the demonic is defined by its quality. So say, the one who drinks blood, the slasher, the messenger, and so on. So they often carry a definite or demonstrative article. Okay, so we have Pakhet the Scratcher, of course, in our text. Many Egyptologists, among which Professor Lucarelli too, and Lights, think that the article signifies reclassification, right? So the name is treated less as a proper divine name and more like a type of dangerous being. So this is something that we can see. So this is a theological aspect of conceptualization of something that is reflected in the grammar. So that seems to be consistent with a trend, a larger trend that we do see in the New Kingdom, and especially in the Ramesside period, of really trying to start to define the demonic, define new demons. We do see that. So you might be acquainted also with the god Seth, for example. Seth was not always a negative god. Later theological machinations eventually classified him as a purely demonic being, like a purely negative being, but it was not always like that. So it's not, there's many instances of this in Egyptian theology in the pantheon, where a being can go from being benevolent or maybe ambivalent, just ambivalent, into fully demonic. And usually these things happen in the New Kingdom, because that's where there is this considered effort to really define who demons are. Again, sometimes we see that as a trauma response to the Hyksos domination. If you recall, some of the gods, some of the Hyksos kings took names such as Apep. Apep, of course, you might be acquainted with, is the cosmic serpent of destruction, the sworn enemy of Re. So if Apep wins, the cosmos collapses. So it's pretty much like a pope named Satan. So it must have been a real trauma to the Egyptians, and it was. So yeah, we have a few of them. So Pajem, the Caesar. So again, demonic beings typically take on that. Ostraka and decrees, by the way, so the oracular amuletic decrees, which are a thing of the Sayyid period, so most of the 21st dynasty, also reflect a lot of named demons. So it's not just grammatical, it's not just subtle. We do see an increase in the material culture connected to demons in the New Kingdom, because that's what happens. We have the oracular amuletic decrees, so like seeking protection from different kinds of demons. Taweret is often mentioned, by the way. But anyway, so they are marking these beings as category-like, so semi-autonomous forces and not unique gods. But it is an attempt, it is still an attempt to neutralize them, because if you don't know your enemy, you cannot neutralize it. So again, this taxonomy, so this idiosyncrasies in trying to really define the demonic is also social. I think it was Rocati who said that, the demonic is a social phenomenon. So the trying to come up with protection, basically. So in conclusion, yes, so there are certain magical in certain magical and funerary contexts, the name of demons or demonized entities do take a demonstrative, okay? So yes, so it's time for conclusions, because I'm also really have time. So, so what I tried to do is to see if it's possible that the goddess Pakhet by the time that Papyrus Harris was composed, could have possibly undergone a process of demonization because of that instance. So she is not generally identified as a demon in the New Kingdom at all, because of course in the 18th dynasty we still have the Speos Artemidos, and she keeps on being a goddess, like a pure goddess, up into Greco-Roman times, although at some point she's really assimilated into the theology of Hathor. So mentions of Pakhet exist in Dendera, for example, in the theology of Dendera, but she's very much a paridra, an ancillary being to either Isis or Hathor. So she kind of disappears from the record. But the New Kingdom is her big era. And so the two things, of course, not mutually incompatible, because we must remember at all times that the Egyptians were really ambivalent. The deities are ambivalent. They can be protective, they can be destructive. So the fact that she does appear as a demon, or at least as a fully negative being in a text like Papyrus 501, is not mutually exclusive with the idea of Pakhet still being a goddess, so still revered in Speos Artemidos, because as we know, the reverence of Pakhet dates far into Roman times in Speos Artemidos, so she's still venerated as a goddess. But at least in the Ramesside period, it appears as versions of Pakhet as completely negatives, like more demon-like than godlike, do appear. Because in this text she's not characterized as goddess either. The Ta is not okay. Sekhmet does not have the article. Tawer does not have the article. And so again, it suggests a strong focus on their beastly nature. Again, Professor Corelli has written an amazing article about ferality, so the ferine aspect of a god or of demons being a marker for the demonic. So we do know that just the idea that something is characterized most as animalistic instead of godly and so on is in itself a marker for the demonic. So this feels like completely befitting. She still does not have a hybrid form, like a highly hybrid form, so we do not see Pakhet depicted in any other way really other than woman and lioness, so we don't see hyper hybrid versions of her. By the New Kingdom, we do find composite creatures, so the composite aspect is really much an aspect of demons. Many times they have like 3 heads, 7 wings, and so on to show they're also all powerful. But still, the monstrous or the bestial is still demonic. Again, as I said in the beginning, so it's something I haven't mentioned. So there's a possible connection with the idea that someone like Pakhet should be placed in the desert. Let me explain that. So the Speos Artemidos is the first rock-cut temple of the New Kingdom. Okay, other Speos follow. I think so. Now, I think it was Jacquet and Darnell have connected Speos, so like rock-cut temples, to the cult of Hathor, right? Because it serves as a sort of a den for a lion, right? For the hidden goddess that is distant and so on. So they see a very strong Hathorian aspect in a place like Speos Artemidos, and I absolutely agree with that. It's also possible that, so in the text of Seti I, it is said that Pakhet herself scratched out Speos Artemidos with her claws from the living rock. So she made her den in the mountain herself. I have not found any other instance where a god is said to act this way on the environment. Okay, Hathor resides notoriously in the mountain, but she's not said to destroy the mountain whatsoever. So the idea of scratching out, hewing out a hideout place for her, for that to become a sanctuary, that's also strong demon vibes. Again, we do see that. We do have the werets again. We don't know exactly what they are, or other beings that do haunt natural places. We do have the werets of the lakes, the werets of the channels, the werets of the mountains, and so on, or even of the alleys. So, of course, like, you know, they can populate any area that is like liminal, because it's not really the settlement. It's not a temple. It's not a market, and so on. So it's liminal, right? So I do think there might be an argument. This is debated, but of course, I mean, to my knowledge, it's debated. Darnell doesn't like this, but the idea that the Eastern Desert, towards which the Speos Artemidos is in fact projected, and we also see that, by the way, by Beni Hasan, of course, because of all of the processions of caravans and people from the Near East, from like, let's say, throughout all the desert. What is the Amu people, the Asiatics, and so on. So that is very much a liminal space. The Eastern Desert is a liminal space where it is absolutely fair to imagine that an Egyptian thought that it might encounter a griffin. There are griffins depicted on the walls of Beni Hasan that are otherwise like really realistic. There are many species of animals. So we at least have to think about the possibility that the Egyptians thought that the Eastern Desert was cursed to some extent, or at least dangerous, right? There are many dangerous animals even nowadays in the Eastern Desert. So again, the Pakhet would be placed in such a place that is liminal in itself, in a sort of a grotto that she herself carved out. Again, that I believe that sort of bends at least the category of nature, so the category of the divinity. Now, again, so demons often just visually wield some sort of weapon. Even gate guardians in the Book of the Dead, they have knives, or they wield a snake, a lizard sometimes, or some kind of weapon. Because they are fearful, of course. Pakhet does not wield any attributes. It is not, let's say, reflected in any of their epithets. But I put here, again, the spelling of the Nebet Seret, Lady of the Valley of Set. So you can see that there's a knife there. So that seems to be a reference to the fact that it is a rock-cut temple, of course, or that the wadi itself has been hewn out by Pakhet. So that is her domain. So I like to think at least about the possibility that toponym spelled as it is, and it's always spelled with a knife, it might be a visual pun on danger, of course. So the knife is usually determines words that are not like, unless the word is butcher's block, the knife is usually a telling determinative. So it could at least be a visual pun on danger. Again, Pakhet is lioness, so the lionesses roam the wadis. She's said to roam the wadis to go to hunt. So of course, she might just jump on you at all times. So just to conclude, so again, I think that Pakhet's character in Papyrus series could be reasonably considered as bending the boundaries between nature and demon-like figures, especially in view of the new influx of demonic beings of the new kingdom, really, and this effort of into creating a taxonomy of evil, at least defining evil. And indeed, the category of nature does prove inadequate when one is faced with the elusive nature of supernatural liminal beings as demons, what we call demons. And so it should be noted that, the identification of the emic, classification of these intermediate beings, demons, diamonds, however we want to call them, will, I think, yield more productive results in the future if we pair it with a more flexible approach to what is traditionally considered nature in ancient Egyptian religion. So, and assessing the validity of these taxonomies according to which we classify ancient Egyptian beings must remain a crucial reference within, I think, any research framework from now on for everyone interested in the category of the demonic. So, to be continued, but thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. We have time for questions. Anybody has any, please?
Yes.
Like, if you don't mind, if I have a question about the Harris Papyrus.
Mm-hmm.
So it was totally destroyed somewhere along the line, and what we have is a copy.
So the first, it was originally 9 sheets. What we have is 7, so 2 were destroyed, and they are preserved in fragments and are now at Heidelberg. But again, so the old record, so before Shabbat, so before 1860, says that there was a gunpowder explosion in Alexandria in the deposit where all of the Harris, because it's a huge collection, all of the Harris papyrus was stored, and the first 2 pages were lost. So even Shabbat, who first published this in 1860, worked on basically a trace copy. So the original was not available anymore. But again, as you've seen, I don't think there was any an explosion there.
The follow-up to that, the trace copy was done by...
It was done at some point, I don't remember the name, I'm sorry, between Harris gathering it and so before 1860, because Shabbat itself already worked on the tracing. So the papyrus was lost between 1860. So before 1860, yeah. It's very unfortunate. Yes.
This is a bit tangential, but on the curved ivory kind of funeral piece, I noticed that Pakhet was holding a couple of swords, which I'm wondering if that particular shape of sword is characteristic of protector entities, because it's not the kind of sword that the actual soldiers carry.
Right. So this is not necessarily Pakhet. So this is just what we call an apotropaic wand, which are made out of elephant tusk usually, or hippo tusks. So this would be part of the magicians, let's say ancient magician, itinerary magicians set of tools. They were usually employed in birth rites, so to ward off evil. And indeed, so on magical wands, we see different kinds of entities, mostly lions, ceropods sometimes, so like the kind of Near Eastern fantastic animal we see also on the Narmer palette, for example, so like with a very long neck. Then we see crocodiles a lot. So we do see a lot of dangerous animals being in birth tusks or so-called magical ones, because all these are beastly. So they're feline in nature, they're scary, they are potentially dangerous. So basically the idea is that you're harnessing their power, their inherent power, because they're dangerous beasts, in order to ward off other entities. So often, they carry knives. Sometimes they carry, sometimes there's a serpent carrying a serpent, because like it works, it kind of works like that.
The hippopotamus has also got swords. So.
Yeah, and even at the end of that, there's a very weird Anubis at the end of it, like a seated Anubis with a knife too. Yeah, knives are really popular in the netherworld. That is, supposedly they're made of obsidian, because obsidian was, according to myth, what the god Re, in the form of a cat, uses to behead Apophis every day. So like depictions of the great cat of Heliopolis and so on, beheading the snake. Usually in their Heliopolitan cosmogony, it says to be obsidian. So all these knives kind of like replicate the power of the famous knife, the more famous knife. Yes. Yes.
So on the slide where it was like the 6 or so lines where it's like the jaws were bound of all these gods, there were a few that we don't know what they were. Were those likely mythological beings, or do you think that they were most likely actual beings?
So so they seem to be actual animals, like earthly ones, because if you look at the determinatives, they do have, so there's a definition before some of them, so before the last three, so like all the animals with long tail, so that kind of points out maybe to a predator or something. So if you see the determinative, it's always the tail. So that determinative does not, so there's no indication of divine there, at least as far as classifier goes. So I would think that these are real animals. I mean, there's many like wild beasts we don't know the names of, or at least we have the names, we don't know exactly to which animal they correspond to. We still don't know what the hell, what the Scythian animal depicts, really. So some of them, yeah, they might be a hybrid. I mean, they might be, a serpopard has a word, but it's probably not a real being. And it's usually not determined with anything related to divinity. So like it's possible actually that they might have been mythological or like made up, but in their minds they were perfectly real. So like as a serpopard in Beni Hassan, just thinking that I might run into some of that. But yeah, great question, thank you. Oh boy, went very long. Yes.
Sorry if this was discussed at the beginning, very beginning, but so would household deities like Bess and Tower fall within the demon or the nectar category, or is that a gray area? Because they were very much benevolent deities, but they didn't like have a temple to themselves and had more of a
right. So
magical role.
Right. So they kind of fall into the category of apotropaic beings, meaning they are recognized as gods. They don't necessarily have temples, but they do have domestic shrines. So they do have cultic places, but usually they are within the, let's say, domestic sphere, because indeed Taweret both and Bess protect against nightmares, protect childbirth, and so on. And of course, I mean, both of them. So Bess, is actually a perfect example. Bess is a composite creature. It's a kind of a dwarf with a lion's mane and a tail, and it's usually sticking its tongue out and looking directly at the observer, which is also a feature of guardians usually. So like if you, I think it's something here, many times guardian demons are depicted. So are depicted as frontal. So the ancient Egyptians don't do frontality because, as you might know, they do a sort of a three-quarters. But if you look at this guy here, he's looking directly towards you. So that is a feature of guardian demons, or guardians, really. And it is an apotropaic gesture. So like I'm looking at you because what I'm really looking at is at the potential danger. So I'm warding off the danger by saying, by the way, I have a knife. And I'm looking at you in the eyes. So Bess, definitely yes. And he also carries many times snakes or knives too. So they are not... there's Beset, which is like a female counterpart to Bess, which is often involved in magic, not necessarily, not execration magic, so like not dangerous, destructive magic, but they do exhibit that typical ambivalence of a being that is, let's say, ugly, so like, and monstrous and hybrid, because of course that is the feature that keeps the evil at bay. So there is at least one instance where there's a Bess-like being in the Book of the Dead. I think it's actually captioned as Beset, and that is definitely scary. But it's scary because it's apotropaic. So, like, to my knowledge, no, we don't usually perceive either Taweret or Bess as dangerous. They definitely are fearful or fear-inducing, but that's kind of what they do to ward off evil. But they're usually perceived as benevolent beings. Yeah. Otherwise, they wouldn't put them. They would not put them in domestic environments.
Yeah, I was asking like about the distinction maybe between like demons and nectar, because
right,
like there's
gray
area in a way.
Right. They're definitely perceived as Netcheru, more like, or or natural-like beings. I mean, Taweret and Bes are kind of weird because they're not usually in human form, so they are kind of monsters in themselves, because Taweret is also like a hippo, like a visibly pregnant hippo, so she's also kind of scary. But they still, I would say they pertain still more to the category of nature than they do to demon, let's say, because you never see them in negative behavior. So like their demeanor is usually always benevolent. So I would say definitely nature-like.
Sometimes I see Hathor presented frontally. Does that have to do with her protective aspect, or?
Well, I mean, she's depicted frontally on a sistrum often, right, on mirrors and so on. I think that is never thought about it. I mean, all Hathorian objects have an amuletic function to some extent. So yeah, I mean, Hathorian capitals usually are frontal and so on, but the goddess herself, you don't see her, of course, like frontal. But the tools, yeah, they do in fact depict her, yeah, frontally. So actually, yeah, maybe. So good.
A couple of questions, sort of tangential. First of all, you mentioned Seth as a demon, which that had not actually occurred to me. I mean, it makes sense. But at what point do you decide that Seth is it again textual?
It's definitely textual. It's also iconographical. So by the Ptolemaic period, it's definitely a demon. So you often see a scene where Seth is depicted as a donkey. So donkey is very much a Scythian animal too, and he's bound as a captive on temple walls. So this is an active execration ritual against Seth, and he's seen being speared or at least stabbed or whatever by Thoth often and Horus. So the donkey in magical texts is very much thought to be a demon. So I think Professor Lucarelli has written extensively on this, but yes, definitely. So in his form as a donkey, it's always characterized as demonic. And yeah, I mean, he seems to fall from grace, like fall from the category of, I mean, everything is still nature, again, as we said, but it definitely veers towards the demon realm, because now it becomes the archetype for evil, basically. Apep is kind of forgotten at some point. I mean, he's still there, but Seth becomes the target of execration magic and everything. In terms of linguistics, in terms of lexemes, again, there's not a word for demon, but it definitely exhibits demon-like behavior in magical texts up to, yeah, well into Greco-Roman times. Yeah, I mean, arguably Apep is a demon too. Yeah, so it's when the being is entirely evil, then we can definitely, more comfortably think about a demon instead of a god.
Oh, okay. So at least to the next question, which is there a category of demigod that is good?
Well, that would be probably the Ahus, so like the spirits of the transfigured, deceased people. So the Ahus are, basically the spirits of dead people. They're considered transfigured, meaning they've gotten through the process of becoming a luminous being of knowledge and perfection. Mm-hmm. So they've sort of passed the test, of course, of spell 125. So they've passed the ushered into the netherworld. But it's tricky because these were spirits of humans, of course. So maybe they can be characterized as demigods, although an Ahu is very much perceived as a natural category. They can also turn very evil, though. So again, this ambivalence is pretty much real for, what's it? Maybe any god, really, because it's not that the god necessarily turns evil or against you, but there are the bows again. So like they're called like powers of a god. The bows of a god are scary manifestations of a god. So basically, if an ancient Egyptian was tripped on a rock and hit his head, it was like, oh my god, the bow of a deity must have been involved. So they were responsible for like minor misdemeanor or minor, bad things happening. But yeah, so the god himself, apart, I mean, unless it's Sekhmet, for example, I mean, she's definitely the one carrying the pestilence and so on, sending the Hatiu demons and so on. But Thoth can turn evil. Ra can turn evil. And they can even like send each other's bows or uputiyu demons, or the messengers, or the hatiyu demons towards each other, because one other thing that defines demons, we don't have any mythology for them. So they don't appear in the big accounts, the creation myths, and so on. But we do see in magical religious texts, where of course there's a bit more freedom, maybe, of to elaborate mythologies and so on. We do see that there's mention of Anubis, for example, sending his hatiyu demons against Pharaoh, for example, or the Pharaoh himself harnessing the bows of Osiris against his enemies. Like this is like in an account of Ramses II. So again, the gods kind of never get their hands dirty, really. Like they send manifestations like the bow or the ahus and so on, but technically they don't do bad things. They never really, get their hands dirty.
But are there good things that need to be done that the gods themselves are too important or too elevated to deal with, so they have demons doing something for them that's not constructive, running the universe, whatever?
We don't see them in that function. Like we usually see them in baleful function. Yes. Sometimes they're seen as punitive agents of gods, for sure. Of course, it's malevolent. But like, for example, there's an ostracon in Deir Medina where a woman is complaining that she got blind, and she believes that she got blind because she stole some offerings from the sanctuary, the shrine of Taweret in Deir Medina. So she stole some offerings, and she's like, oh God, this is why I became blind, because this must be the bows of Taweret getting vengeful against me. Well, I guess, she's guilty of stealing. That in this case, we could see the demon as an agent of Maat somehow, like to punish the wrongdoer. Yeah, sometimes, but usually, So the demons are, the demons can be either independent, so like acting out of their own will. So, for example, when they haunt lakes and so on, or they can be agents of other gods, and then they do their bidding, which could be seen sometimes, I guess, yes, as a restoring Maat to some extent, through evil, of course. But yes.
Are inanimate objects used in a magical way, like a wizard's wand, or
absolutely, absolutely. We are lucky enough to have from different eras, especially from the New Kingdom, some magicians' chests, especially in the Ramesseum. In the storerooms of the Ramesseum, there were some burials, and the tomb of the magician has been found. So there was a guy, likely a priest. So all magicians are priests, because medicine, magic, religion is all the same kind of set of skills. And they found a box that I think was also marked with the name of Heri Seshta, so like the Master of Secrets, which is a title that many initiates, let's say, priests initiated to certain priesthoods and so certain rites and so on had. And inside the box, they found bronze wands, like in the form of snakes. So that we do know that was used like that to ward off evil. There's a doll, a sort of doll carrying two snakes, which is a Beset figure, by the way, so like a female Bes. There's amulets, of course. There's magical texts, definitely. So like the magician chest has been found for sure. And recently they also found one in Pompeii, actually, so like south of Egypt, but which was definitely with some Egyptian influence, because some of the amulets were Egyptian. So like that was like the witches, the sorceresses' chest and so on. But yes, there is a word. Hekait. It's a word for magician, and again, this is just like a priest that would be specialized in the business of amulets, protective, apotropaic magic, and sometimes execration texts. It's like literally destructive magic for the purpose of Maat. Against enemies of Pharaoh, Re, and so on. But yes, and we have evidence, of course, of bad magicians, from the trial of Ramses III, which apparently involved magical foul play, because one of the priests had stolen, because there was, of course, a royal library inside the palace. He apparently had stolen some scrolls from the library of the palace, some magical scrolls, in order to appropriate the knowledge and use it against the king. And they also made, they were the first one, because, I don't know about the Near East really, but the Egyptians did use voodoo dolls some extent. I mean, best I can, I can call them. I mean, there's actually a really terrible one from the Greco-Roman period. I mean, there's a bound woman, she's naked, and it's a clay one, and it's still filled with all kinds of metal nails. Like it's really a ball of nails like that. So that is, so, but they didn't use nails at until Greco-Roman times, but we definitely have wax figures. They were part of execration rites where the wax figuring would be inscribed with red ink, because red is the color of bad, magical texts and spells and so on, and then burned in the fire, or clay ones. The clay ones sometimes remain. Then there were many other execration rites, like the breaking of the pots. It was a red pot, because again, red is the color of execration. Then someone would stomp on them, then it would drop all of the sherds in a pit and then burn it again. So yes, they used a very wide array of, they were very skilled with that, yes. I mean, they thought that Hekau was a totally real thing. Indeed, we shouldn't probably talk about supernatural beings in ancient Egypt, but rather preternatural. So magic itself is not supernatural. It's not outside the realm of nature in ancient Egypt. They totally believed of it as a totally natural thing, which is why it's also a morally neutral tool. And it's not like because magic, of course, again, we think about Judeo-Christian magic as opposed to religion, right? So magic is superstition, obviously.
But there's like positive symbols too, like the
Oh, of course.
Stone or
many, absolutely. Yeah. No, amulets go either way. I mean, amulets are usually for protection. Execration rites are bad, meaning like they are meant to destruct. But most of amulets, statuettes, magical spells, so they're all meant to engender a positive outcome. Yeah, unless they are specifically directed to harm. In the case of the harem conspiracy of Ramses III, that is bad. That is bad magic. Just because it's directed against the wrong, because it's disrupting Maat, not because itself the magic is used. There's no such thing as black magic in ancient Egypt.